Hey folks, we begin chapter two, which covers a lot. It's on evolution, genetics, and experience. And if you take a biology class or take a few biology classes, you'll see that you could take a whole class just on evolutionary biology. You could take a whole class just on genetics or even epigenetics, just parts of this. Okay, so we're going to hit a few topics here in this chapter. We'll do a few videos on each, and we're going to focus on the things that are going to be most relevant going forward in the chapter or in different chapters as we go forward. So we're going to cover three main ideas covered throughout the text. Those are functional psychology, heritability, and then the nature nurture issue. We'll walk through what each of those mean in this video here. And then in the following videos, we'll spend particular time on heritability and the nature nurture issue. We're going to do limited detail on evolutionary theory in terms of um, origins of species and that sort of thing, because its direct relevance to what biopsychologists do on a daily basis is somewhat limited, though functional psychology is going to rely on evolutionary theory pretty heavily. Your textbook does have a whole section on that if you want to get into it, and we have supplemental materials if you're taking my course. So the first main idea is functional psychology. Functional psychology attempts to explain the utility or purpose, that's the function, of behavior. And it's built into the theory of people who think about functional psychology that this is modified over years of human and other animals' existence. So the function of a behavior is passed down from generation to generation. If a behavior has utility or purpose, then it will continue to be passed along at higher rates and that sort of thing. It has a purpose within the environment. Okay, so that's functional psychology. And so as we go throughout the chapters in this course, we're going to be asking functional questions. This is a biological question. What is the function of having a biological system that does these things? So why do we experience a fight or flight response? Why do humans sleep for 8 hours? Why do we go unconscious every day? Right? Why do humans develop language? So these are all psychological things, the fight or flight response, sleeping, language, are all psychological things. And a functional psychology question would try to figure out why. What is the function or purpose of doing these things? And you can think about each of these on your own. The second main idea is heritability, and we'll get into greater detail on this in the next video. Heritability is the extent to which individual differences in genetics contribute to observed differences in behavior or mental processes, not just outward behavior. Right? So essentially, we're asking how do genes affect the nervous system, and the nervous system then affecting psychology? We'll get into the difference between Mendelian traits that you may be familiar with from your biology classes. We'll come back to that later, or polygenic traits. Polygenic means multiple genes. We'll talk a bit about twin studies and DNA sequencing to try to figure out specific genes or gene sequences or combinations that might predict behavior or differences in behavior. The third main idea is the nature nurture issue. And you might have heard of this as the nature nurture debate about the relative contribution of genes and experience to behavioral capacities of individuals. So, how much is my behavior or my personality or my tendencies, right, to behave in certain ways? How much of that is due to my genes, and how much is it to experience in the environment? The nature nurture terms, I don't particularly like very much because nature includes the environment, right? That the environment is natural. And nurture, how you're nurtured, is always going to interact with your, um, uh, sorry, so nurture and nature are very similar. They both involve the environment. So um, I tend to prefer genes environment issues. So how much is due to genes and how much is due to environment. And in particular, we'll talk about how these interact, because it turns out that any complex behavior is going to involve both. And so the real question is, how do genes and environment interact to lead to development over time of different psychological traits? And then we'll talk about a concept called epigenetics, which you may or may not have heard of before, that complicates this a little bit in terms of additional mechanisms beyond just genes that are biological, that you may even inherit, that can then inform how you develop and will interact with the environment as well. Okay, so those are the three main ideas. Okay, um, functional psychology, heritability, and the nature nurture issue. In the rest of this video, we're going to cover functional psychology in just a little bit more detail, and then in the following videos, we'll cover the other two. So as I mentioned with functional psychology, we're asking questions like why, right? So why do we have a fight or flight response? Why do humans sleep for 8 hours a day? Why do humans develop language? Oftentimes, when you're taking a functional approach as a biopsychologist, you're going to do comparisons, comparative psychology, like we learned about chapter 1 is oftentimes useful. So I might compare human behavior to other animals. So why do humans experience a fight or flight response? Well, compare humans to other animals. Why do humans sleep for 8 hours? Let's compare sleep patterns for other animals. Why do humans have language? Let's compare that to other animals. And what we see for each of these is that there's a bit of a difference when we do those comparisons, right? So fight or flight response is pretty general. Basically, all animals have a fight or flight response. And so the utility must be something very general. It must be something that just facilitates survival to have a basic fight or flight mechanism. Okay. So there's going to be something fundamental developed early on, both genetically and probably in the development of the individual animal that helps them to react to their environment, which it seems pretty clear why that would help us to survive, right? Sleep time across animals is variable, though, right? So humans sleep 8 hours a day, but horses only sleep about two, right? So there must be some utility to sleep, but there's no utility to 8 hours of sleep specifically. 8 hours must be optimal for us for some reason, and 2 hours must be optimal for horses for some reason. 23 hours for sloths, right? So, what is the difference in our development over the years that led to the different sleep patterns and the utility of different amounts of sleep? We'll come back to that in the sleep chapter. Why is it that human language seems to be more sophisticated than other animal communication? Sometimes we'll say only humans have language. Sometimes we'll say that, lots of animals have communication, but human communication is more sophisticated, and we've just put the label language on that, right? So why was it particularly useful for humans to have language, right? And basically, it's that we're very weak and killable, but if we team up and communicate and share information, that can help us to survive. So these are the general kinds of approaches to functional psychology, and we'll return to some of these explanations as we go throughout the semester. The major factor here that people are considering, as I already mentioned, is natural selection, right? So, how are these traits going to help us with survival and also reproduction, right? Surviving long enough to have more of us, right? So, if a trait relates to survival and relates to reproduction for a species in this situation, it's going to continue to the next generation because it's going to be passed down by genes. Okay, so we think about how fight or flight supports survival and reproduction, how different sleep times might be more useful for, why it might not be useful for horses to sleep a lot, right? Maybe because they're out in a big field and they only eat grass, right? So sleeping a lot's not going to be useful for them. Okay? Why is it particularly useful for squishy humans to be able to communicate? Right? So we'll encounter these explanations as we go. Okay, we're going to stop there. And that's basically all we're going to cover on functional psychology because we're going to keep having these kinds of explanations as we go. But keep this survival and reproduction mechanism handy in the back of your head. And in the next video, we're going to cover the second main topic, heritability. And then after that, we'll cover the nature and nurture issue.